To an ancient human, a clear blue sky was often a terrifying sign of impending death. You are standing on the edge of a limestone cliff in what will one day be called southern France, but right now, there is no France. There is only the shivering expanse of the Mammoth Steppe. You are looking up at a sky so painfully blue it feels like a physical weight, but you aren't admiring the view. You are searching for the dust. In this world, a clear sky means the moisture has been sucked out of the atmosphere by the massive ice sheets to the north, leaving the ground to turn into a fine, gray powder that the wind carries in choking clouds. You realize that your survival depends on a world that is essentially trying to freeze you, starve you, and bury you in silt all at the same time. The world of your ancestors wasn't just a wilder version of our own. It was a functionally different planet operating under a set of geological and atmospheric rules that have since been deleted. We tend to imagine the ancient past as a pristine, green Eden, but the reality was far more violent, alien, and precarious. Why didn't the very air of the Pleistocene kill the first people who dared to breathe it? The common myth we tell ourselves is that if you stepped out of a time machine 50,000 years ago, you'd recognize the landscape, just with more trees and fewer parking lots. But that's a fundamental misunderstanding of how the Earth's systems were functioning during the last glacial period. For the majority of human history, the normal state of the Earth wasn't this lush, stable Holocene climate we enjoy today. It was a jagged, oscillating nightmare of extreme shifts. According to research led by Dr. Sarah Talamo, the timeline of human arrival in Europe coincided with a world where the sea level was so low that the geography of the continents was virtually unrecognizable. You wouldn't be looking at the same coastlines or walking through the same forests. In fact, for long stretches of time, there were almost no forests at all in the places we now consider wooded. The sheer volume of water locked in the ice meant the planet was profoundly dry. The lush European forests of today were replaced by a hyperproductive but brutal grassland known as the Mammoth Steppe. This was a biome that doesn't exist anywhere on Earth today, a unique mixture of high-nutrient grasses and herbs that supported more animal biomass than the modern African Serengeti. But it was a world of edges and extremes. Could the humans living there ever truly feel safe in a landscape that was constantly erasing itself? The most striking thing you would notice first isn't the cold, but the height of the ground. Because the oceans were roughly 400 feet lower than they are now, the world was significantly larger. You could have walked from the site of modern-day London to the coast of Denmark without ever getting your feet wet. This was Doggerland, a vast, low-lying plain that was the true heart of Europe for millennia. It was a paradise of wetlands, rivers, and lagoons, teeming with life, and it is now a ghost kingdom at the bottom of the North Sea. When ancient humans looked out from the cliffs of Dover, they didn't see a channel. They saw a massive river valley where the Thames and the Rhine met in a colossal confluence before flowing south. This wasn't a world of islands, it was a world of bridges. The Bering Land Bridge, or Beringia, wasn't a narrow strip of mud, but a subcontinent nearly 1,000 miles wide. It had its own climate, its own ecology, and its own permanent residents. To the people crossing it, they weren't migrating to the New World. They were simply living in a vast, cold interior that happened to stretch between two landmasses. But if the land was moving beneath their feet as the glaciers advanced and retreated, what was happening to the air they breathed? The atmosphere of the ancient world had a different flavor than ours. During the peak of the last ice age, the planet was incredibly dusty. High-resolution ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica show that the atmosphere contained up to 20 to 25 times more dust than it does today. This was caused by the intense winds blowing off the ice sheets, picking up glacial flour, rock ground into a fine powder by the weight of the ice, and depositing it across the globe. This created the massive loess plateaus that today provide fertile soil for much of the world's agriculture, but at the time, it meant the horizon was often a hazy, yellowish blur. The sun would have looked different, muted, perhaps more orange, filtered through a permanent veil of mineral dust. This also changed the smell of the world. Instead of the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers, the ancient air would have smelled of dry stone, ozone, and the musk of massive herds of animals. The sheer density of life meant the olfactory landscape was dominated by the biological reality of millions of bison, horses, and mammoths. It was a pungent, crowded world. If the air was heavy with the earth itself, how did it change the way they saw the light? When the sun went down, the ancient sky offered a spectacle that no living person can truly comprehend. We talk about light pollution today, but even in the deepest wilderness, our sky is influenced by the moisture and particulates of a warming planet. For an ancient human, the night sky wasn't just a backdrop, it was a physical presence. The Milky Way would have been so bright it cast soft shadows on the ground. The stars wouldn't just be points of light, they would be textured, colored, and layered in a three-dimensional depth that made the sky feel like an ocean hanging overhead. But there were times when the sky became a source of genuine, existential dread. Around 41,000 years ago, a phenomenon known as the Lost Champs event occurred. The Earth's magnetic field weakened to a fraction of its normal strength and eventually flipped. Researchers like Dr. Alan Cooper have published findings in the journal Science suggesting that this collapse of the magnetic shield would have had catastrophic effects. Without the magnetosphere to protect the atmosphere, the ozone layer would have been shredded. The result? The sky would have been filled with permanent, localized auroras, not just at the poles, but everywhere. Imagine looking up and seeing the entire heavens dancing with rhythmic, blood-red and neon-green fire, while the sun's ultraviolet radiations scorched your skin during the day. This wasn't a mythical wrath of the gods, it was a measurable geophysical event that our ancestors had to survive. But if the sky was a canvas of fire, what did that do to the way they understood the passage of time? Survival in this environment required a level of sensory attunement that we have almost entirely lost. The soundscape of the ancient world was defined by an acoustic openness that is impossible to find today. There was no mechanical hum, no distant drone of tires on asphalt, no vibration of electrical grids. In that silence, sound traveled differently. You could hear the footfalls of a herd of reindeer from miles away. You could hear the cracking of a glacier 10 leagues distant like a gunshot in a small room. This meant that humans lived in a constant state of peripheral awareness. Every snap of a twig, every change in the pitch of the wind, carried vital information. But the most terrifying sound wasn't the wind or the ice, it was the vocalization of the megafauna. We think we know what an elephant sounds like, but a woolly mammoth had a different vocal architecture, designed to carry across the frozen tundra. The roar of a cave lion, which was about 25% larger than a modern African lion, would have been a physical force, a low-frequency vibration that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. This was a world of monsters that were very, very real. But if the animals were the kings of the ground, what was happening in the space between the stars? To understand the ancient perspective, you have to look at the other humans. One of the most alien aspects of the ancient Earth was that Homo sapiens were not the only people on it. For tens of thousands of years, our ancestors shared the valleys of Europe and Asia with Neanderthals and Denisovans. This is the ultimate uncanny valley experience. Imagine walking into a clearing and seeing a group of people who are unmistakably human, yet fundamentally different. They are shorter, more heavily muscled, with prominent brow ridges and wide, deep rib cages. They are wearing skins, carrying sophisticated stone tools, and speaking in a language you don't understand, but with a tonal range that feels familiar. Genetic evidence proves we didn't just look at them, we lived with them, traded with them, and had children with them. The world was a mosaic of different ways to be human. To an ancient person, the idea that there is only one type of human would have seemed as absurd as the idea that there is only one type of bird. The diversity of the human experience was baked into the landscape. But if seeing a mirror of yourself was shocking, what happened when they looked at the things that were truly alien? The animals of the Pleistocene were not just larger versions of modern ones. They were specialized machines designed for a world of high-velocity movement and extreme caloric density. Take the short-faced bear, Arctodus simus. This was the largest terrestrial mammalian carnivore to ever walk the earth. Standing 12 feet tall on its hind legs, it had long, slender limbs built for sprinting at speeds of up to 40 miles per hour. It was a kleptopredator, an animal designed to run long distances to find a kill made by another predator and then simply take it by sheer intimidation. For a human hunter, the short-faced bear wasn't just a threat, It was a shadow that could appear from the horizon and overtake you in seconds. Then there were the Megatherium, giant ground sloths the size of elephants, with claws a foot long. They were slow-moving but virtually invulnerable. The ancient human world was a constant negotiation with these giants. You didn't own the landscape, you leased it from the megafauna. Every movement you made through the tall grass of the mammoth steppe was a calculation of risk. Why didn't these titans simply wipe our ancestors off the map? The answer lies in the human capacity for landscape memory. While a bear has instinct and a lion has strength, humans had the ability to store and transmit complex information about the world's changing state. This was vital because the Green Sahara wasn't a myth, it was a recurring reality. Every 20,000 years or so, the Earth's wobble on its axis changes the strength of the African monsoon. This transformed the Sahara from a wasteland into a lush network of lakes and rivers. Ancient humans saw in North Africa where hippos swam in what is now the middle of the desert and where giraffes were carved into the rocks of the central Saharan mountains. They saw the world change in cycles. They knew that a valley that was a desert in their grandfather's time might be an oasis in their own. This required a brain that could hold multiple versions of the same place in its mind at once. But is it possible that the biggest threat wasn't something with teeth, but something far more subtle? The most dangerous paradox of the ancient world was the Toba incident. Around 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano erupted on the island of Sumatra. This was the largest volcanic event of the last 2 million years. It released an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. For the humans living at the time, the world quite literally ended. The sky would have turned black for years. The volcanic winter that followed caused temperatures to plummet and vegetation to fail across the globe. Genetic studies suggest that the human population was squeezed through a terrifying bottleneck, possibly dropping to as few as 10,000 breeding individuals. We were an endangered species. The world became a cold, dark, ash-choked graveyard. To those few thousand survivors, the Earth would have looked like a dying planet. They lived through a literal apocalypse and had to rebuild the concept of humanity from the soot. This event likely hardwired a specific kind of resilience into our DNA, a disaster mindset that still influences how we react to crises today. We are the descendants of the people who didn't give up when the sun went away for 6 years. And if the sky was a canvas of fire, what did that do to the way they understood the passage of time? As the glaciers finally began to melt and the Great Drying came to an end, the world underwent a transformation that was both beautiful and tragic. The rising seas began to swallow the coastal plains. This wasn't a sudden flood, but a relentless, creeping tide. In a single human lifetime, you might see the ocean move inland by several miles. Your childhood home would be underwater by the time you were an elder. The stories of Doggerland and Beringia weren't lost. They were transformed into the flood myths that haunt almost every culture on Earth. When an ancient person looked at the sea, they weren't looking at a permanent boundary, they were looking at a thief that had stolen their ancestors' hunting grounds. The lost Atlantis isn't a single place, it's a collective memory of the 25 million square kilometers of land that were drowned at the end of the last ice age. The world we see today is just the attic of the world our ancestors inhabited, the high ground that stayed dry when the basement flooded. But what if the most important thing they saw wasn't the land or the animals, but the connectedness of it all? Ancient humans didn't distinguish between the natural world and themselves. They were embedded in the trophic levels of the mammoth steppe as much as the wolves or the mammoths. Their art, the stunningly realistic depictions of animals in caves like Chauvet or Lascaux, proves they didn't just see animals as meat. They saw them as personalities, as powers, as co-inhabitants of a sacred space. The ancient Earth was a world where every rock and river was heavy with meaning. There was no such thing as empty space. The world was full of eyes. Every shadow in the forest was a potential conversation or a potential death. This created a psychological state of hyperpresence. You couldn't afford to be distracted. You couldn't afford to live in the future or the past. You had to live in the exact, vibrating present of the world as it was. However, the biggest reveal isn't what changed, but what didn't. Despite the fire skies, the mile-high walls of ice, the monstrous bears, and the drowning continents, the inner world of the humans was identical to yours. We have found 30,000-year-old flutes made from vulture bones, tuned to the same pentatonic scales we use today. We have found burial sites where children were laid to rest with thousands of hand-carved ivory beads, a testament to a grief that is perfectly recognizable. They looked at the same moon you see tonight and felt the same swell of wonder and insignificance. The alien world of the Pleistocene was inhabited by people who were, in every cognitive and emotional sense, you. They weren't primitive versions of us. They were us, tested by a world that was infinitely more demanding. They were the masters of a planet that was in a state of constant, violent flux. They didn't just survive the ancient world. They mapped it, named it, and left us the keys to understanding our own place in the cosmos. There is a profound irony in our modern perspective. We look back at the Ice Age as a time of lack of technology, lack of stability, lack of comfort. But to the people who were there, it was a time of more. More animals, more land, more darkness, more light, more silence. Their world was louder in its biological intensity. When we look at a modern forest, we are seeing a depleted, quiet version of the landscape they knew. We are living in the aftermath of a great biological thinning. Our world is safer, yes, but it is also lonelier. We are the only humans left. The giants are gone. The sky is muted. We have traded the terrifying beauty of the Pleistocene for the manageable safety of the Holocene. But the memory of that older, wilder world is still there, buried in our myths, our fears, and our very selves. Why does it matter that the world once looked so different? It matters because it proves that permanence is an illusion. The coastlines we build our cities on are just a temporary suggestion made by a fluctuating sea. The climate we think of as normal is a rare, 10,000-year anomaly in a history defined by ice and dust. Ancient humans understood this deep in their bones. They knew the earth was a living, breathing, changing thing that owed them nothing. They lived with a humility that we are only now beginning to rediscover as our own climate starts to shift again. If we want to know what the future looks like, we have to look at what the past looked like to them. A world where the only constant was the need to adapt, to remember, and to keep walking toward the horizon. Here is the question that stays with you. If you were transported back to that ridge in ancient France, and you saw the sky turning red from a magnetic flip, and you heard the roar of a cave lion echoing through a valley that doesn't exist anymore, would you feel like a stranger? Or would something deep inside you, some dormant, ancient circuit, suddenly click into place? Would you realize that you aren't visiting the past, but finally returning to the environment your brain was actually designed for? We spend so much time trying to fix our world to suit our needs, but we forget that we were built by a world that refused to be fixed. We are the children of the upheaval. It's easy to feel like we've conquered the Earth, but that's only because we've been living through a period of uncharacteristic geological silence. We have built our civilizations on the assumption that the Earth is a finished product, a static stage for our drama. But the ancient humans knew better. They watched the stars move, the ice grow, and the seas rise. They knew the stage was moving under their feet. We think of ourselves as the masters of the planet, but we are really just the current tenants of a house that is still under construction. If you want to know how quickly the world can turn into something entirely alien, you only have to look at the numbers. The final dismantling of our modern comfort comes not from a story, but from a cold, hard fact of chronology. We think of ancient humans as a prehistoric abstraction separated from us by an unbridgeable gulf of time. We imagine the woolly mammoths as creatures of a deep, mythical past, long gone before the real history of civilization began. But we are wrong. The Great Pyramid of Giza was finished around 2560 BC. At that exact same time, and for nearly 1,000 years afterward, there were still woolly mammoths living and breathing on Wrangel Island in the Arctic. The last of the Pleistocene giants didn't die out in some unreachable caveman era. They went extinct in 1650 BC. That is roughly the same time the Hittites were establishing an empire in Turkey and the Shang dynasty was rising in China. Our ancestors didn't just see the ancient world, They lived in it right up until the moment we started writing down our own history, proving that the alien Earth isn't a distant memory, it's just a page we've only recently turned. If this exploration of our planet's hidden history has changed the way you look at the horizon, consider joining us as we continue to peel back the layers of the world we think we know. There are many more ghost landscapes waiting to be rediscovered, and the more we look, the more we realize that the past isn't as far away as we think. What is one part of the ancient world you wish you could have seen with your own eyes, even if just for a moment? Let us know in the comments and stay curious.